Hello everyone, and welcome to my presentation. Just over half a year ago, there was a bit of a discussion going on in British social media, at the center of which was Sir Terry Pratchett, the author of the Discworld series, who died in 2015. The main question of this discussion was what his stance would have been on transgender people, with the transphobic so-called gender-critical movement, surmising that his views would have aligned with theirs. In response to this assumption, Terry Pratchett's social circle reacted quite appalled, with his daughter Rihanna Pratchett in particular tweeting, and I quote, "This is horrifying. My father would most definitely not be a GC if he was still alive. Read the books." And for my presentation, I would like to discuss what you can find if you do just that. In particular, I want to look at his 2003 novel Monstrous Regiment and how it is a playground for gender performativity. And so the thesis statement that I want to work towards is as follows. The narrative of Monstrous Regiment features characters that, through the circumstances of their lives, are led to experiment with and re-evaluate the gender and gender performance. Through these acts of deception, revelation, and resolution, they both uphold the norms of their society and challenge them. Now, before I ever move on to show you my agenda for the working towards this, allow me to briefly explain to you the basic premise of the novel. Monstrous Regiment features the protagonist Polly running away from home, disguised as a man, in order to join the army. As events unfold, she gradually learns that every member of the regiment she joins is in fact a woman, including the vampire and the troll. From a thematic standpoint, the story is about concepts such as lies and deception, and how the truth behind something or somebody is oftentimes more complicated than it may seem. This is especially the case with the regiment's Sergeant Jackrum, as you will see over the course of this presentation. So, with the premise explained, I will now give you my agenda. To start us off, I will establish a theoretical framework based off 3 of Judith Butler's texts, which I will then apply to the novel. For that, I will look at it from 3 angles. Firstly, there's deception surrounding gender. Then, secondly, revelation of gender. And lastly, resolution with regards to gender, the story. With all of these examined, I will then conclude my findings before leaving things with the obligatory works cited page. Which now brings me to the theoretical framework. For this, I will draw on 3 texts by Judith Butler. The first of these is Gender is Burning. The text deals, of course, with several themes, but the one that is most relevant to this presentation is her concept of the norm. The norm in this case refers to societal norms regarding sexuality and gender, or to be more precise, heterosexuality and being cisgender, and also, to a lesser extent in this context, being male. And one major thing that Butler brings up with regards to this norm is the common criticism that people in drag or lesbians face. For the former, that they are acting this way due to rejection by women, and in the case of the latter, the common question they face of, oh, who's the man in the relationship? This essentially posits the aforementioned norm as the root cause of all deviations from the norm. Heterosexuality is the cause of people in drag presenting themselves the way they do, and lesbians are trying to replicate a straight relationship. It's all rubbish, of course, but it speaks to a trend that Butler notes. Any deviations from the norm are more accepted if they do replicate it in some manner. In essence, this means that crossings of the norm are themselves crossed out. Similar concepts are explored in the second of Butler's texts that I want to use, that being doing justice to someone. In line with what I said earlier about deviations from the norm being more accepted if they replicate it, Butler here posits that people who exist outside of the norm, trans or intersex people in this case, are outright pressured into replicating it in order to be accepted. Throughout this text, one of the things that Butler brings up is what role socialization plays in deciding a person's gender. And importantly, she ultimately comes down on one thing. No amount of socialization can change a person to a gender they are not. Cis men cannot become women. And that what I would like to extrapolate from this, no amount of male socialization can make a trans woman a man, for example. Doing justice to someone, then, is to accept their existence outside of the norm, no matter how much they deviate from it. Though it would be remiss of me not to talk about how she also mentions that for as much as an individual may cross the norm and exist outside of it, this existence in itself does not create a new world. This then brings me to the last text of Butler's that I will be drawing from, even if it plays a relatively minor part. From Undiagnosing Gender, what is relevant to my presentation is what Butler says about transitioning, or being openly transgender. Namely, that there's an undeniable stigma associated with all of these things, and that is often enough to discourage somebody from being open about it. So, I will now begin with the first part of me talking about the contents of the novel. And as you already may imagine, based off the premise I explained to you earlier, there's obviously a lot of deception going on within the novel. Not only Polly, but her entire regiment are all women disguised as men. To use Butler's terms, they all replicate the norm, even though they have collectively crossed it. The protagonist Polly particularly excels at this deception, being presumed male by the other members of her regiment for far longer than anyone else. Yet, despite this, Polly is not exempt from being deceived herself, as she initially believes the regiment's lesbian couple to be a heterosexual one. On that later. In terms of further deception, it is also heavily involved in one of the novel's comedic highlights. Towards the novel's climax, the regiment infiltrate an enemy keep as washerwomen, or rather, they attempt to, because the moment they make it in, they are pulled aside by guards who believe them to be men disguised as women. And on the other hand, the regiment's assistant male lieutenant, who also infiltrated the keep in disguise, he managed to get in without rousing any suspicion. This actually speaks to something that Catherine Lashley mentions in her article about the novel, the theory of the simulacrum, which says that the copy of an original can so thoroughly replicate it that it gets mistaken for it. And this theory goes both ways, as it later turns out that a large amount of the military's high command consists of women disguised as men, who, despite the power they hold, also choose to maintain their society's gendered norms and keep the army officially male only. A last instance of deception then comes with Sergeant Jackram, who is revealed towards the end to have been designated female at birth as well. In fact, the quote I used for the title of this presentation, the one about, "Upon my oath, I'm not a dishonest man," is something that he frequently says in various forms throughout the novel. I will go into more detail about him later, but for now, let me just clarify that I will continue to use he, him pronouns for this character. I would now like to share a select few quotes from the novel that I believe speak to deception rather well, and in particular how it applies to the protagonist, Polly. This first quote speaks to the ease of this deception, and the Sox in this case refer to her using them to pat her crotch. Now, for the second quote, this quote in particular, I would argue, speaks to the concept of socialization as Butler talks about it. No matter how much male socialization Polly experiences, both from the army and her peers, she ultimately still is female and does not feel right being treated as male. And this is perhaps illustrated in the final quote for this part, which are Polly's thoughts a bit after these, where the narrative says, "I want to leave the girl behind me, but it seems I brought her with me." With these quotes, I would like to argue that it is possible to read Polly as an allegory for a trans woman. She is expected to be male by the society around her and treated as such, but no matter how much she is socialized as male, her identity remains female. I will discuss this later on, but for the time being, I want to move on to the next point, revelation of gender. As I've already alluded to earlier, and it's probably to be expected, the deception that the characters engage with cannot be maintained. We experience these revelations through Polly's perspective, who gradually makes these discoveries. One member of her regiment she recognizes because she accidentally sees her pee. Another member Polly recognizes after she witnesses her enthusiasm for / expertise in cooking, and her using sugar as a swear word. And then another member of the regiment Polly recognizes when she does a curtsy instead of a bow. Shortly after that, the regiment has a moment where they all reveal themselves to each other, after which they, however, still maintain their male gender performance. Officially, you might say, they do this because their lieutenant, as well as Sergeant Jackram, don't know about it. In the case of the latter, they think he doesn't know about it. However, in private, they continue to present themselves as mostly male and use their male names when referring to each other. To bring this back to Butler, their crossing of the norm is itself here crossed out to an extent. This becomes especially true towards the climax of the novel, where the regiment begins to act openly as women, at which point other members of the military also reveal themselves to them, but only to them. This all then culminates in the climax. After the regiment plays a key role in allowing the army to achieve a major victory, the regiment is given a choice. Either they remain open women and are punished for their supposed crimes, or the official story gets changed to them having been disguised as women. They become men and stay men. Their crossing of the norm here is fully crossed out, and they are not accepted as people who exist outside of the norm. No justice is done to them. At this point, it is at this point that Jackram reveals that members of the High Command to also be women, using the information to blackmail them into allowing a better outcome for the regiment. And lastly, as a final revelation, it turns out that Jackram himself has been designated female at birth, as mentioned earlier, but at this point, the revelation means little, as we will see in the next part. For now, however, I would like to talk about a few more quotes. This first one is from the moment the regiment reveal themselves to each other. The highlighted part here is the most important. This quote particularly speaks to my offered reading of Polly as a transgender allegory, particularly with her relief at being given the opportunity to reveal herself as a woman. And on an unrelated note to that, we have this next quote, which shows that for all her abilities to spot the deviations from the norm, Polly herself is not exempt from the trappings of the societal norm. This, of course, speaks to the normative explanation for the deviant behavior, which Polly initially resorts to, even though she should be very familiar with crossings of the norm by now. And now we get to the resolution. After all these crossings of the norm, all the deception and revelations, where do the characters go from here? Well, the women in the army, other than the regiment, maintain their male gender performance, saying that it is too late for them to change it in any way, essentially speaking to the fears of stigmatization that Butler talks about with regards to being openly transgender. The regiment, for their part, managed to be recognized as an official part of the military, but it is not true. I'm sorry. I realize I accidentally went a bit too far with my slides, but I hope this still works for you. As I was saying, the regiments are given deliberately girly uniforms and are paraded around like mascots, being essentially treated as just a joke. Most of them don't really care, however, as they gladly take the opportunity to return to a more civilian life, returning to the norm and ending their playing with gender performance. Their crossing of the norm is completely crossed out. Sergeant Jackram, for his part, doesn't know what to do now that he's retired and the war's over, while Polly finds that she can't really return to a civilian life. So where do these two in particular go from there? Well, this I'll explore with my final set of quotes, the first of which you already have on screen right now. And so, the first of these concerns himself with Jackram. After he tells Polly about he has a son that he gave away after birth, and she suggests that she go live with his son, this conversation happens. Despite living as a man for decades, Jackram still has the norm in his mind and considers leaving the army, his excuse for being a man, as no longer being male. While during this final part with him, female pronouns are used, the scene ends with the following line, where the pronouns make it clear where he got from here. Polly paused when she got to the door. Jackram had turned her chair around to the fire and had settled back. Around him, the kitchen worked. Jackram continues his play with gender performance, though I would say it is questionable just how much it really is a play for him at this point. And the next set of quotes. As for Polly, Before confronting Jackram, she is subjected to one more revelation by the vampire character. By this point, Polly has realized that everyone can decide how they present themselves, and it honestly doesn't really matter. This is best shown in this last quote from the very end of the novel, where Polly returns to the army, now a sergeant herself, but openly female. Something that is frequently mentioned in the last part of the novel is that the world has been turned upside down. And as Lashley points out, Polly here turns the joke that she has been turned into itself upside down. Although Polly and the regiment have not created a new world, as Butler would put it, in the end, they still have some capacity to bring about change. By accepting and continuing to play at the play of gender performance, Polly here sets out to new horizons, where gender is a choice that everyone makes for themselves. And this now brings me to my conclusion. With Monstrous Regiment, Sir Terry Pratchett presents a narrative when the ability of the individual to explore and alter their gender identity is something that everyone can do and should be able to do so freely. Ultimately, regardless of what a person is considered by society, who they are is their choice. And with all this said, I'll leave you now with the work cited. Thank you for your attention, and for the last time in this conference, I want to ask, are there any questions?